So, to wrap up, at this point we can go ahead and take some questions. Once again, the question about ruling or judging angels will be pushed back to another week. But hey, at least we made it into the New Testament this time. Are there any questions? And does somebody want to get the microphone? Farrah's going to get the microphone.
Hello. Okay.
Nobody's throwing any fruits at me, so I guess I'm good. Or shoes.
Is there any questions?
No questions? I was about to say, we can go straight to Brian, because I know Brian's going to have questions. About the tomato? That's why I said fruits.
Found a tomato emoji, just in case they want to use one. No questions yet, but somebody pop up in a second.
Okay. So we can go ahead and go to yours then.
Yeah, so the first century, of course, the common people, the Amharites, as in any culture, the common people seem to be very superstitious. And Paul warned about superstitions later on. How did the Pharisees, Sadducees, etc., look at amulets and these kind of things? Were they kind of like today's Ivy League, just kind of thought it was silly, or was that part of their thinking as well?
Well, when it comes to the Sadducees, unfortunately, we have nothing written by them. Right, the only things that we know about them are either from the Gospels or whatever the Pharisees and the later rabbis decided to write down about the Sadducees, or in some cases, Josephus. We don't really have anything on their opinion that I'm aware of. The Pharisaic opinion, which you can kind of see developed later in the Talmud, the rabbinic opinion, seems to be more concerned with how to do it than whether or not you should do it. So there's rules that they handed down about what types of amulets can you make. Can you put on and tie an amulet on the Sabbath or not? And there's this discrepancy of, well, if you're an amulet maker, then no, but if that's not your job, then technically you can, and it's a whole thing. What there isn't is just an outright prohibition, no, these are bad, you can't do it. So from that, I think it's fair enough to extrapolate that they may or may not have had varied views about it themselves. But at the very least, they weren't prohibitive of the people on basically the way that they expressed or worked through these superstitions.
And the hamsa, the hand with the eye, and the red bracelet. I know the red bracelet's kind of later on, but just a general curiosity.
Like their origin?
Yes.
I have no idea.
Okay.
No, I mean, we mostly see those things start to get more popular in the Middle Ages. Of course, there's all kinds of superstitions around the Middle Ages. Now, this idea, because usually you'll see the hamsa, which if you're not aware looks like the hand with two thumbs almost, and it's got usually, almost always, has an eye in the middle of it. The eye there is supposed to be the evil eye, right? And there is a very ancient belief about the evil eye. And again, varied ancient beliefs. But there's even references, like in the Gospels, usually in most Bibles, I think it's translated, Yeshua says, if your eye is stingy, but what it literally says is if your eye is evil.
Or greedy.
Right?
Yeah.
So there was already this sort of understanding that, yeah, greedy, because when you live in a society that is entirely based on community, everyone has to help everyone or else someone's going to starve and so on. To be greedy was an egregious sin against your neighbor. Right? It was a sin against the whole community. And so it was this sort of evil action and attitude of the heart. So there is this sort of superstition already about the evil eye, but as to when that became kind of what you would see today, or like you said, the red bracelet, which both of those, mostly when you see them today, are Kabbalistic. And that's 13th century onward.
So I have two questions, and then Paul and Laurie have one, and then I think Katie's jumping in. So as far as the evil eye, if someone would say cross-eyed, for example, would that be considered an evil eye, like a permanent evil eye, like in the Middle Ages? Or would Judaism is more like the intent, because it had that concept in Japanese? And then also on the Star of David, is that, I know it's used a lot of amulets and whatnot. Was that like a supernatural symbol, Star of Remphan, Star of Chion, or is that just a secular, nationalistic, patriotic symbol to them? Or to have some kind of supernatural concept to it? like if you put the Star of David on an amulet, is that saying you're a very patriotic Jew, or is that saying you're afraid of demons, or how did that play in, the symbol?
Yeah. So the Star of David question. What was the first question?
So the first question is about someone's cross-eyed and whatnot?
Yeah.
Was that considered, those physical features considered evil eye, or is it just the intent you have?
Nothing that I've seen. I've never come across any literature from the Second Temple era about that. Although usually, in general, if you had something wrong with you, it was believed that someone had sinned to cause it. Mm-hmm. So, and you see this in the Gospels when the blind man, they say, hey, who sinned? Was it him or his parents? And that's when Yeshua says no, right? He says, no, some things happen for the glory of God. In his case, he came to heal the man, and that was for the glory of God. But there was this idea that when something was wrong with you, if you were blind, for example, you committed some sin and it made you blind, or your parents did it if you were born that way, and that sort of thing. So there was this sort of spiritual component to it, and there was a sin component tied to various diseases and all. As far as being cross-eyed, like I said, I've never seen any connection to that. The second question pertaining to the Star of David. The Star of David doesn't historically appear as far back as I think most people think that it goes. There's a lot of, to put it very simply, conspiracy theories about it. Mm-hmm. Now I will say one, because you mentioned the Star of Remphan, which is quoted in Acts, but it is a quote of, I believe, Amos.
Yes, Amos 5 and Acts 7.
Yeah, he refers to a star of Remphan. Well, that god, Remphan, that's the Greek word. I think it's Kiyun in Hebrew. Mm-hmm.
Saturn.
It's Saturn. Right. Now, what it literally refers to is the celestial body. So when they look up at the sky, they see sparkly things, right? They didn't have telescopes. They didn't have this conception at the time of that's a planet, that's a dwarf planet, that's a, such and such nebula, and that's a star, and that's a, they didn't have all these categorizations. They had things. They had stars, and that was pretty much it. If it was a twinkly thing in the sky, it was one of these things. So what he's referring to is the star, as in the celestial body. Really, it's the planet Saturn, because people at that time had been worshiping this, and that's why you have all of the planetary names, even by our time, were named after Greek and Roman gods, because they associated celestial bodies with a different god. So what he's not referring to in Amos, and then quoted later in Acts, is the six-pointed star that we today would call the Star of David. Mm-hmm. There is the theory that the Star of David was on David's shield. That's why it's called Magen David, which is the shield of David. Or that it was his signet. Mm-hmm. There's also been the theory promoted that because the old, I think pre-Phoenician script, the letter Dalet, like delta in Greek, was a triangle. And so since David's name is Dalet Vav Dalet, it was two Dalets. And you put two triangles over each other, and they look like a six-pointed star. That's also a cute theory, but I've tried to find ancient evidence of it. I can't find any. So the idea that, it comes from David, maybe, but you can't really prove it. The last thing on that, really, the way that we see, again, what we come to know as the Star of David, doesn't come about until about the same time, about the Middle Ages. And it originally, as far as I'm aware, the oldest that you can find it is when Jews were being persecuted in various parts of Europe. They were told that they had to put a star on anything that was made by a Jew, and that way you knew it wasn't worth as much, which is what was later adopted by the Nazis in World War II for the yellow stars. There is...
Go ahead.
No, I was going to say, there's some precedent there, right? Like, why star? Why not the word, Yud? Why not a letter? Why that? So they had clearly already been using it at some time, but the furthest back that we can find it is that it basically did, at some point the belief came about that this six-pointed star, this was on David's shield, and that's why we use it, is because it's a shield, and David's shield is often associated with spiritual protection. Right, and we read Psalm 91 earlier. It's one of numerous Psalms. I read one last week. I believe it's, I want to say 18, I don't remember. But there's numerous Psalms where he talks about his shield, right? Mm-hmm. God is my defense, my strength, my fortress, my rock, my shield, all these different sorts of terms. So the star became associated with God's protection. Again, all of those are basically theories at best. What you can say is that there are six-pointed stars that appear in nature. Right? There are flowers that bloom in the shape of a six-pointed star. I believe the bottom of a pomegranate, I think, has a a six-pointed star. Which then you could also make the theory that since the high priest's garments had pomegranates on it, that he had six-pointed stars on his garments. That's about the best that I can say. Like I said, it is unfair to say that it absolutely comes from David, but I would think it's even more unfair to say that it's some sort of pagan symbol they adopted and worshipped and all that.
So Paul and Lori were asking about the millennial kingdom or the New Jerusalem, and why would anyone need to be healed during that time?
Why would anyone need to be?
Because that would imply they were sick to begin with.
Oh, why would anyone need to be healed at that time?
Why would someone need to be healed?
Yeah, so that gets into eschatology, which everybody knows I don't really care to talk about. No, so there's actually a difficulty in translation there. The most common translation, obviously, is that the leaves of the tree, right? That's what we're talking about. The leaves of the tree are for the healing of the nations. But the word for healing is also the word for maintenance, right? When you give someone their food, their rations, their provisions, that's their food maintenance, if you will. So you could almost say that the leaves of the tree are for the well-being of the nations. For their upkeep. It's the same idea as Adam and Eve. Well, did they need to eat from the tree of life once and then they live forever? Or do they continually eat from it? Right? Do they need it to be maintained? And we don't know.
And they could cut them off if they acted up.
Do what?
If it was for maintenance, if they acted up, he could cut it off, like the rain in Tabernacles and during Zechariah 14. If it was raining, if the nations didn't show up for Tabernacles, then he cuts off the rain.
Right.
If you're eating the fruit to maintain and your nation doesn't act right, he could just say you don't have access to it.
Yeah, and that also gets into the differing, theories, issues, etc., of what is being depicted in the New Jerusalem as it descends and it sits on earth. Is that at his return, or is that after his kingdom? Somebody's going to get mad at my answer no matter what it is. But I tend to believe that the New Jerusalem is for the new heaven and new earth, which is after 1,000 years of his kingdom.
It's like an Edenic idea of plenty, like just the concept of there's plenty for everybody. There's no lack. There's all the nations.
Yeah, that basically, yes. That it's for the maintenance, the upkeep, if you will. That anybody can eat of it, and you will never go hungry. It will never run out. A never-ending supply of foodstuffs, essentially. Which you could also compare with Yeshua's resurrected form. We don't know what it was, and John even says that, right? He says, what he is, we don't know, but we will be like him. Right? We read that a minute ago in 1 John. We will be made like him. He ate post-resurrection. Right? He went and ate with them. So he can eat. Does he have to? What happens if he doesn't? Could he starve? Well, then he couldn't die again, could he? All these sorts of questions that we ask about his form. Because that's something that we really don't have any understanding of, is the resurrected body. Now, it wasn't just a new one, right? Because his old one wasn't left in the tomb. He took it with him, and that was the point, that he was resurrected. So there's so many questions that we have about it that we don't know how it's going to work. But like I said, what I lean towards is this idea that the tree of life is a perpetually eternal life-giving source. Not that there's still people, after sin's been put away, after death is no more, after all of this, there's still people that are getting sick and having to be healed and all of that.
So the idea of well-being. It's
well-being, maintenance, upkeep, that sort of thing. Of course, then you also have to ask the question of what happens if you don't eat it. Do you eventually wither away and die, or I don't know. I have no idea.
And I think the last one on here is there's back and forth about the wisdom of Solomon, as in the book. There probably is a cartoon now, so that's kind of scary. With the book, the legend of wisdom of Solomon, we touched on that a little bit, but maybe elaborate what that was and how it came about and what the Jews were.
Yeah, so there's a lot of legends about Solomon. I mentioned a few about David and how David cast out demons and this sort of thing, which you can even draw that conclusion from the narrative about David, because Saul was tormented by an evil spirit and David played the harp and it left him, right? So you can kind of see there's definitely a precedent here for reading it that way, for interpreting it that way. But it grew even more so with Solomon. There are multiple books that are attributed to Solomon outside the Bible. There's one called The Wisdom of Solomon, even though it was written hundreds of years after Solomon. They still say it was written by him. There's, Psalms of Solomon, I think, is a separate one. Odes of Solomon. There's different books, as well as other references in other things that refer to Solomon. But like I said, there's just a lot of legends about his ability to exorcise demons.
I mean, the comment, like in witchcraft circles, he was the ultimate wizard.
Yeah.
There's a biblical
And-
concept. Oh, it's King David's son, and there's like Solomon's the witch doctor.
There's a lot of beliefs in
Warlock.
the occult and in, kind of secret society sort of things that drew from Solomonic, sounds like salami. Solomonic. That sounds like demonic. I'm not going to win here. Anyways, imagery that came from Solomon. Even the Freemasons have the pillars of Boaz and Jachin, right? Which is what it says that Solomon named 2 pillars. I don't really have any information about it, but they draw a lot of symbolism from it. Yeah, there's this idea that Solomon, in his infinite wisdom, possessed all this knowledge. That's why, like I said, during the time of Josephus, he says, I know this guy Eliezer who has these incantations that Solomon wrote, and when he reads these, demons are cast out and all this, because it's perpetuating that belief that Solomon exercised this ability to cast out demons.
And your bestie, Katie, over here, wants to differentiate between the millennium and the New Jerusalem and all that, like parse that out. And the Normandus said maybe there's a new Torah for the maintenance, like the tree of life is a new Torah. Thoughts, I guess, is a request. She said, sorry. So the coming kingdom is at the millennium. Then the New Jerusalem is also a kingdom, but restored without any defect.
Yeah, so my contention, I'm going to answer these totally out of order. My contention for the New Jerusalem being post-millennium is simply because if the millennium is coming in this, if he returns to essentially this world, rules over this world, as I think we have prophetic evidence to say that he will. You mentioned a while ago, Brian, Zechariah saying, hey, if you don't come up to Sukkot, you don't get rain. Well, that's still, people are still disobeying. If you have to issue a warning, come up or you don't get rain, the people can still disobey, right? There's still essentially sin in the world. So if that's happening during what we would typically call the millennial kingdom, what I don't think happens is that New Jerusalem comes down and he rules for 1,000 years, and then he destroys it and then makes another New Jerusalem, right? Because according to, I think it's 2 Peter, he's talking about this age, right? Will be the elements of this age will be melted away. So there's going to be a new heaven, new earth. Right? We had that prophesied in Isaiah. We have that prefigured in really throughout the entire Bible. The whole concept eventually is to get us back to what Eden was supposed to be. So I don't think we'll have New Jerusalem on this earth only to destroy it and then have new heaven, new earth, and New Jerusalem again, and then New Jerusalem or newer Jerusalem or whatever. So to me, I don't think it comes down at the beginning of his return. I think it's after the new heaven, new earth, New Jerusalem. I think all of those three go together. And what was the other question?
I think so.
He said, what was the other question?
What?
Oh, what's the other question? I thought that says other question. So the Normandus are postulating perhaps the leaves of the tree or the new Torah for maintenance. The tree of life is the new Torah.
It's difficult with Revelation because John draws so many different references from the Tanakh. He draws a lot out of Genesis. He draws a lot from the prophets. In the references that he makes, the way he alludes to other things, the way he paints the same picture that was already painted by some prophet or apocalyptic vision, and then changes something to make his point. So it would be fair to say that, well, if you know that the Torah is a tree of life, then maybe that's what he's talking about. The Torah, as it's generally understood, what we would call the Torah proper, Genesis through Deuteronomy, the law, right, was given at Sinai to restrain transgression. And that's going to offend people too, I'm sure. Like, no, it always existed. Paul says the law was added, right, because of the transgressions of man. Why do you need Torah? Because you sin. If you're not sinning, do you need to be told, thou shalt not covet? Because according to Paul, he wouldn't have even known not to covet except the law came and aroused the commandment aroused in him and his whole thing. So there will certainly be rules. But I think more of what's taken away is our desire and inclination. The Jews would say the evil inclination. Our desire to break the rules. Our desire to rebel against God. Ultimately, sin isn't just simply a breaking of one of the 613 commandments. Sin is doing anything contrary to what God has expressed. That's why James can come along later and say, to him who knows to do good and does not do it, to him it is sin. Really, it's anything that God has said, anything that God has expressed going contrary to any of that is sin. So you need law when you have sin, because something has to be done, something has to be dealt with. So if sin is done away with, I guess for me the question remains, what need is there to point out and identify sin? But again, I don't know. I'm the person that generally avoids Revelation because there's so many different theories and nobody's ever happy with any of them. So.
Sells a lot of books, though.
Do what?
Sells a lot of books, though.
It does. It does. I can recommend a lot, but.
So is anybody in the in-person audience want to throw a tomato or have a question or anything?
Going once, going twice. I need a gavel. I've said that before. My wife is shaking her head no. I don't get a gavel, apparently. All right.